I would like you to give a big round of applause to our author today, Molly Ringel.
That's better, isn't it? Not being as tall as Clay. And thank you, Clay. That was excellent considering you're doing everything today. And I'm grateful for the Society for being here all these months. Actually, it's years now, isn't it? And that really, we out here in West Seattle, we writers appreciate not having to drive across the bridge and crawl along I-5 at 3 miles an hour to get to a book event. So it's much handier to just come right down here. And I enjoy these events a lot, this series. And I hope you'll have lots of questions and remarks at the end, because that's the really fun part. So be thinking about those while I ramble up here. As the intro, biographical background, I grew up in Oregon. I didn't just go there for college. I did grow up there, and actually it was in the other university town. It was in Corvallis, and that's where my parents still live. But I did visit the Puget Sound area all my life because I had family here in Seattle, and we have a family beach house that we've had since before I was born, I think, over in Mason County. So I've always thought of it as this beautiful area, and my now husband and I decided Seattle was where we wanted to live after we graduated from U of O. So, and this is where we have lived since the late 90s, except for a 3-year break when we went to grad school in California, and then immediately came right back here because it was way too hot there. And at least that was I demanded that we come back here. It was too hot there. He went along with that. And we've lived in West Seattle for more than 10 years now. It must be, maybe even 12. So this is where we bought our starter house, which is still currently our only house, and are raising our 2 kids. And throughout all of that, school and day jobs and being a parent, I have been writing. Writing is what I've wanted to do since high school, certainly, maybe even middle school. I was doing it in middle school. I don't know if I thought of it as a career yet in middle school, but certainly when I was 12 or 13, I started writing short stories or novellas. In terms of length, that's what they were. I wasn't thinking of them as novellas at the time. But eventually I moved up to novels, and novels are still what I prefer to write and what I usually do write. While growing up, I kept getting told that it was hard to make a living as a writer, which, mind you, is perfectly true. And so I did study creative writing, but I also studied other things. At U of O, as an undergrad, I studied anthropology, and at grad school in California, I studied linguistics. But I'd like to point out that I'm not making a living at either of those things either, so I sometimes wish I had just majored in English like I originally wanted to. Still, I don't regret having studied things like anthropology and linguistics, because those, how languages and cultures work, those are things I can use in writing. Those have inspired a lot of my stories and have given me details and richness that I can add to them. They're good things to know. And yeah, tempting though it is to live in an attic and never see anyone, you kind of do have to know something about the real world in order to write. Most of us. Okay, some people have gotten away with it, but... So I'm glad that I did study other things. But I was always reading fiction as a kid and a teen, and still, of course. I remember when I was a kid, I really liked both realistic fiction, like Judy Blume, Beverly Cleary, as well as fantasy, such as the Oz books or Peter Pan. And that mix is reflected in what I have always liked to write, is sometimes the real world, sometimes fantasy, but nearly always fiction. I'm not really the journalist type, I guess. I think there's too much research involved, and I'm lazy is kind of usually my excuse. On the fantasy side, obviously another one of my influences was Greek mythology. This, when I was 9, and I know that it must have been 9 because inside it says Merry Christmas 1984. My grandmother gave my little sister and me this book. It's a very popular one. A lot of people, this was their introduction to the myths, as it was for me. And it's a very good book. It's very beautiful and colorful and illustrated inside. And as far as I can tell, pretty faithful to the traditional Greek myths. And this was my introduction to it, and they were so crazy and colorful and just fascinating. They were a lot like the Oz stories, actually. That's what they seemed to me like. They were that kind of interesting mix of insane ideas and adventures. And I was just fascinated by them and always have been. I'm not Greek at all in terms of ancestry, so, but the Greek myths, of course, are famous throughout all of Western civilization. And thanks to growing up with this book and to all the research I later did for this series that I'll be talking about, I actually ended up knowing far more about Greek mythology than I do about, say, Celtic, where my own ancestors largely come from. Maybe someday I will get around to reading about that too. At some point in school, I suppose, I became aware that writers often retell a myth or a legend as the basis for a new story. And I liked this idea, and I held on to the notion of doing that myself someday. And my favorite myth, the one that I wanted to use and eventually did, was the myth of Persephone. Turns out this is actually a lot of people's favorite myth, but I didn't know that until just recently. But that was lucky. This myth, it has a lot going on. There's a lot of factors, a lot of possible interpretations, a lot of symbolism, a lot of things changing for a lot of characters, which all means an especially good story. And I also thought it could be seen as rather romantic, at least if told in the right way. And one thing I always also like to write is a love story, whether it's real world or fantasy that we're working with. So the myth, in case you don't know it, it goes something like this. Hades is the god of the underworld, which is where all souls go after death. He gets the good, the bad, and the in-between, and he has sections for all of them, and therefore he's not equivalent to Satan, although that's a common misconception. In Greek myth, he's generally described as gloomy but just, and no, he doesn't have blue flames for hair. Thank you, Disney. As the Disney Hercules had this. He's actually the brother of Zeus and Poseidon, so he probably looks just as good as either of them. And it's only because of drawing the short straw, they literally drew lots, that he has to rule the underworld instead of the sea or the sky. Now, the underworld is a literal underground cave system. It's huge and dark and spooky for the most part. Some of it is scary and fiery, but it also has parts that are attractive and pleasant with flowers and trees and rivers and other landscaping, and that's where the good souls get to hang out. It has a palace where Hades lives. So one day Hades, looking up into the surface world somehow, sees Persephone, who is the goddess of spring and the daughter of Demeter, the harvest goddess, and he falls instantly in love. He lures Persephone out by herself into the middle of a field by making an especially beautiful flower grow there. She's collecting flowers. And it's sometimes described as a huge multi-blossomed narcissus or daffodil. And then when she's reaching for it, he cracks open the earth under her feet, flies up in his horse-drawn chariot, seizes her, and pulls her down into the underworld. And no one knows what's happened to her. But once he has her down there, he informs her she is now his wife and the queen of this realm. Now, a lot of people stop right there and say, well, that's kidnapping, that's horrible, that isn't the slightest bit romantic. And I agree. That's a terrible approach to our modern sensibilities. But, water. However, as Greek mythology goes, it's not only pretty common, but it's also not that bad. It's sorry to say, but nearly all the male gods and many of the female at some point have an episode where they get infatuated with some mortal or nymph or fellow god or some being and chase down, threaten, intimidate, or otherwise just assault them in their passion. Zeus does it lots of times. Apollo does it. Hermes does it. Poseidon does it. I mean, they all do it. It's all over the place. And Hades, to his credit, only does it this once, as we're told. So there's that. And then he doesn't abandon the woman or try to cover up the evidence, like Zeus usually does, he turns her into his queen, his wife. He gives her more power than she used to have. That's a little less common in Greek mythology. In fact, most of the examples I can think of, the victim usually ends up dead or pursued forever by some other god or something, usually Hera. So, and making it more interesting, Persephone accepts this power, because when we see her in other myths down in the underworld, she's acting as queen. She's granting or denying supernatural favors to the heroes who have very bravely journeyed down to the underworld. So she has taken on this role Hades has given her. Even though she also, thanks to her mother's intervention, still gets to spend half the year above ground. Sometimes it's a third, it depends which version you look at, but she still gets to be a spring goddess too, some of the year, like before. So she has become this really cool dual goddess. She's both the goddess of spring, all sunshine and flowers, and the queen of the underworld, ruling over the dead. She's kind of the entire cycle of life in one woman. And she wouldn't have been that if Hades hadn't pulled her down. What would she have been if he hadn't? So it seemed to me that this was a very interesting character arc, as they say in the literary criticism, and also that you could make it a rather epic love story. However, yes, I did decide I had to remove the kidnapping element, or at least mostly, and also the myth you may have seen sometimes called the rape of Persephone, and I want to assure you my version does not involve rape either. In early drafts, when I was working on this, I did have Hades kidnap her in accordance with the myth, but so I tried to make it as non-violent and well-meaning as possible, like it was all just a big misunderstanding, or I have to grab you now for magical reasons or something. I suspected it wasn't going to sit well with modern audiences, so I changed up the story. I just made it something different. What I basically did is, in this series, these are the 3 books, an ancient world timeline and a modern world timeline going on at the same time, running parallel, switching back and forth. And in the ancient world part, I essentially have Hades being considered a bit strange and creepy because he chooses to live down in that cave with the ghosts, and therefore Demeter doesn't want her daughter Persephone to associate with him. He's unnatural. He's not the kind of husband she envisions for her kid. So, of course, Persephone only becomes more curious about the underworld and about Hades and contrives a way to meet him anyway and pay him visits down in the cave. And the forbidden love story develops that way, in my version. The modern timeline, by the way, features the reincarnations of Persephone, Hades, and other immortals. And the reason they could have died in the first place is they're not entirely immortal, and there's a cult out there who destroys immortals. This cult is mortals themselves, but they've figured out ways to kill immortals, and they're still active all these centuries later, so they're the antagonists, in my version. I don't really like introducing a murderous, violent cult plotline, but you have to have an antagonist, so. Some further history on the writing of this story. It takes 2 hands now, and it's become a trilogy. Book 1, Persephone's Orchard. Book 2, Underworld's Daughter. And just out this year, Book 3, Immortal's Spring, and that does tie up the whole trilogy. It is now complete. But it started actually a long, long time ago. I first started writing my Persephone novel idea about 20 years ago. So when people ask, how long does it take you to write a novel? The answer is like, well, 1 to 20 years, because, I mean, I've written a book in about a year before, but I don't know, on this one, what do you count? I started writing it 20 years ago, but I didn't write it the whole time, but back then I called it Letters from Hades, which sounds kind of cool, but it's not really the best title because there weren't letters involved for the most part. I finished a version. It was 1 book, ordinary novel length, and I showed it to my family, and I queried some publishers and agents, and some of them were a little bit interested, but nothing came of it then in terms of publication. And I moved on to other novels and other stories, but my family really liked this Persephone story. they kept asking me even years later, "So, what about Letters from Hades? You gonna do anything with that?" I sort of wanted to point to all my other books, and some of which were now published, and say, "I've been busy, I've accomplished things," but the story had stuck in their minds, and that was something I shouldn't ignore. It told me it was probably a good idea for a story, so I should fix it up. And I kind of put off that task for years. But then finally, a few years ago, I opened up the story file again and studied it and thought about what it needed and how it could flow better as a novel. I wrote down some notes and ideas and finally embarked on the rewrite. It turned out I rewrote the whole thing from the ground up. I reused very little, almost nothing from Letters from Hades, except the general plot and character names, of course, and some of the world building, which is writer speak for rules on how the magic and supernatural laws of physics work in this story, and also how the imaginary geography is laid out. And this version somehow turned out much more detailed. It got so complex that I realized before long it was going to have a sequel, and in fact it was going to have 2 sequels. It was going to be a trilogy, because I wasn't going to fit it all into one novel unless it was one of those 2-inch thick fantasy novels with really thin pages, and I wasn't sure my publisher would go for that. So, it's possible, but... So I mapped out a trilogy. And I'd never written a series before. I hadn't wanted to write a series before because I sensed it would be complicated. But by now I'd gotten really into this story. I was actually enjoying writing the new version a lot. I wasn't just pleasing my family anymore. I was really into it. I wanted to finish it. So I kept at it, but it was not easy. It did help to decide ahead of time it was going to be a trilogy, and I could plot it out accordingly and decide how to make each volume build upon the last, as well as making sense as a series. And still, always, while working on it, I kept thinking about book series I had read that were satisfying to read and ones that were disappointing to read, and trying to figure out all the ways in which a series could be successful or fall down on the reader. My main goal was to not disappoint anyone who liked the first book. And though I think I did all right with that, I'm hoping reviews are all right so far, I'm in no hurry to write another series again. And the books I've been working on since then are once again standalone novels, and they feel so wonderfully simple to compose after this humongous double timeline trilogy. Still, I'm very proud to have finished a trilogy, and I'm excited for it to find readers who like that kind of thing. I am a reader who likes that kind of thing. As to fantasy in general, and writing about it, part of what made the series so complicated was the fantasy element. It involves magic and an afterlife, so I had all these supernatural rules and rather deep existential questions to figure out. It took me something like 4 years to write and revise these 3 books. And so I had plenty of time to wonder why I do this to myself. Why choose subjects like gods and immortality and magic fruits and flying ghost horses? I mean, in the real world, there are many complex issues and fascinating places I could write about. So why do I often ignore those in favor of writing about something that no one can prove exists? In short, why write fantasy? Well, for starters, I don't always. What I'm working on lately is a purely real-world story. But when I do write fantasy, why? Well, why does any fantasy writer? We might as well ask. I can't speak for all of them, but I suspect part of it is the restrictions of real life frustrate all of us. You know, why can't we heal each other instantly? Why can't we shapeshift? Why can't we manipulate forces of nature? Why can't we see and talk to ghosts? Having wishes like this that transcend what's possible is part of what makes us human. And in fact, our species' oldest known stories are myths and folklore, and they're full of exactly those type of wildly creative scenarios. Every culture around the globe has stories like that, and they've been telling them for millennia. So looking at it anthropologically like that, I feel that fantasy writing is actually deeply traditional rather than shallow or fanciful or trendy. it has become popular lately, but I don't think it's just trendy. It's been around a while. Writing about magic also allows for interesting problems for the characters and interesting solutions to them. In some ways it makes things harder because if you have magic at your disposal, why can't you just fix everything with it? So you have to come up with rules and restrictions to your magic and stick to them. Basically, the magic should never be too easy. If you have easy magic that fixes everything at no cost, that's a lovely daydream, but it isn't a good plot. It lacks tension and drama. As the characters on Once Upon a Time like to tell us, if you've seen that show, they like to repeat this about every 15 minutes. All magic comes with a price. So this is a good rule, actually. But the rules and the price of magic, those get to be completely zany. That's where it becomes fun. Now, you know this already from fairy tales, right? Like, yes, this character can turn into a wolf, but never a bat. That's just how their magic is. Yes, you can reverse the evil spell, but only if you accomplish these 3 bizarre tasks before sunrise. Sorry, those are just the conditions. Yes, you can enter and leave the underworld safely, but don't eat or drink anything while you're there, otherwise you'll be bound to it. That's just how it works. This is always how it goes in magic stories. It has this nonsense logic, but that's kind of why we love it. Maybe it works for us because real life doesn't actually make very good sense either, if we're honest. So why not have some fun with it? And I do love the crazy places that a fantasy setup can take us. Without giving too much away, there's a plot twist at the end of Immortal Spring that is the kind of outlandish device I can only use once in my whole career, and I love it. It's because magic is involved, and I hope readers will love it too, although I'm sure some will just think it's insane. But I have heard from a few people who say they love it so far. People often ask what I'm working on now or what's coming out next. The real-world novel I mentioned, which I'm in the middle of writing, is probably not going to be the next book out, because before starting that one, and after finishing Immortal Spring, I wrote an entire standalone novel, which is once again paranormal, or magic. It's in my editor's hands. That one is called, working title, The Goblins of Bellwater. So far, no one knows that except my beta readers and my editor. Now you do. It's about goblins and other fairy creatures in the woods in a small Puget Sound town in the modern day, causing trouble for people. If you've read the long poem Goblin Market by Christina Rossetti, it's loosely based on that. Inspired by that, I should say. Not really based on, but yeah, if you like crazy magical fairy tale rules, that will be the book for you. So I'll see what thoughts my editor has on helping shape that up. I wanted to end with one more question people sometimes ask, which is, what's your favorite part of being a writer? What's the best part of the process? Is it getting published and being able to share my stories with the world and hear from readers? Actually, no. I love that part too, but it isn't the best part. I thought it would be when I was in my teens and 20s. It was the big shining goal I was reaching for. But as I grew up, I realized, for one thing, I have little to no control over whether people will publish my books, read my books, or like my books. And if I'm hanging my hopes on something I have little to no control over, I'm setting myself up for frustration and unhappiness. And anyway, chances are very slim that anyone out there will ever love these stories and these characters quite as much as I do, or not in the same exact way that I do. So I've come around to realizing the best part is the creating. The time when I'm writing the story and it's still rough and unfinished and not ready to be published, but it's new and it's exciting and it's the honeymoon phase. The honeymoon phase. And that's what I love most, is the part where I'm actively creating something, where it's just me and the story. And that's what I encourage everyone to do, is create, follow your calling, whatever it is you want to do that makes you happy when you do it, and doesn't rely, at least not much, on other people or their actions and opinions. Do something for the joy of doing it, not for external validation or for money. If you do it for yourself, you'll probably even do it well. And goodness knows you'll be happier, and therefore you'll actually be more fun to be around, so it will actually benefit other people. Thank you, and I welcome discussion questions. Melanie.
What was your process for creating 3 books, like one book that would stand alone, you know, like have beginning, middle, and end, and all the parts, and yet keep the whole trilogy as being a whole one story as well, you know, the 3 parts, but the one.
Yeah, I had to make sure that each book would have kind of one. Well, there's going to be a couple different goals and challenges, and like that there will be one that I keep doing that, one that the whole trilogy will need the whole space of the whole trilogy to solve, but then another one where, okay, well, we have a bad guy here maybe who we can defeat within this book, and then the second one, another challenge comes up, still relating to the bigger problem, but we can take care of that one, and then in the third book the same thing happens, so that there's kind of smaller pieces that you can break it down into so that there is a feeling that you've taken care of something within each volume, and yet, right, with the ends of the first and second one, you have to leave some things unfinished so that the third book still has something to do. And of course you have to raise the stakes each time, which is part of, I don't know how anyone goes beyond 3 books. How did they do 7 or something? Raising the stakes and stakes and stakes. I don't know how you do that. Maybe someday I'll know, but yeah. That was part of why it was really challenging. Yes?
Do you let people in your family or ask them to read it before you turned in to the editor? I mean the manuscript, the publisher. Does your family read it?
Some are family. I have beta readers basically. For each one, lately in the last several years I've asked certain people who seem like they might want to read it or be useful as readers to read through it. Sometimes it is someone in my family. Often enough it's just, you know, my friends, or Melanie's done it, and people I've exchanged critiques with online sometimes. I may never have even met them in real life. So yeah, I think that's a good practice before sending it to the editor so she doesn't have quite as much to rehaul, overhaul, and redo.
Maybe you just explained it, but I'm not familiar with the term beta reader. What do you mean by that?
Oh, beta reader. Yeah, and I recently heard that sometimes there's something called an alpha reader, and I'm not totally sure what the difference is and what they mean by what the distinction is, and we should Google that. But what I mean by beta reader is someone who's gonna, for free basically, just read through my manuscript and give me their thoughts on how it flows as a book and what needs fixing. So it's a kind of a test reader. They're not copy editing at this point. They're not line editing for grammar and formatting or anything. It's more like, how does the story work at this point? What's your thoughts on that?
I called that my close personal advisors.
Yes, exactly. It's the Literary Advisory Committee.
Is there
That
just
sounds right.
one usual beta reader?
No, I've been lucky enough to have usually at least 4 or 5, sometimes
same
more.
book?
Yeah, on one book per book. They vary from book to book a certain amount, but some of the people have been pretty consistent throughout that they've just liked doing it. It's very nice of them. And then I do it too for, you know, some of them if they're writers, or for other writers who once in a while pop up an email to say, could you beta read something? Do you have time? And so yeah, it's a kind of paying it forward in the universe. You do a few yourself every year, and you ask a few other people to do yours every year, and I think it's balanced. Yes.
What are your feelings when your beta readers come back with some things that you really feel are very strong, but they don't feel is that strong? I mean, how do you work with that?
Like if they say, this whole scene that I love, like, I don't see the point of this or something. Yeah. Well, you know, this is where it helps to have more than one. Like if all of them or most of them say the same thing, I figure they're onto something. They probably are right. That if they all say, this part of the relationship doesn't work for me, or this scene needs expanding, and most of them say that, they're probably right. If it's just one outlier who says that, I go, I can do it if I want, and I don't have to if I don't want. But yeah, if they're voting the same direction, I should probably listen. It isn't always easy. Like at first, you always want to be, but no, I want to argue with that and say that I don't want to have to do the extra work because I already did it. Is usually what it comes down to. So, but I usually end up very grateful that they said something, because then when I really think about it, I do end up coming up with a better scene than was there before. So it's a good tool to have if you can convince people to do it.
Do you find yourself revisiting myths, you know?
The myths?
Yeah. As you evolve your
I certainly,
theologies?
well, now that I'm done with the trilogy, I don't reference them as often, but I was doing a lot of looking stuff up. There's a really cool website, if you want Greek myth in particular. It's called theoi.com, theoi.com. And they have cross-referenced like all the original sources of Greek mythology they can find. So you look up like Hermes or whatever, they give you all the listings of everything that was said about him and all the different sources, and they've compiled it into an explanation. And you have a web page for each of the, not just the major gods, but like anyone who was ever mentioned in Greek mythology, and they're linked up together, and you can click through it all, and it was a wonderful resource, and it was that. And when you do that kind of thing, you realize there's actually a lot of myths that contradict each other, or versions of the myth. There's not one single myth about Persephone or about any of them, really. Some people at certain times told it one way, and some people at other times told it another way. So, I always want to be able to say, in the original myth, this is what happens. But there's no one original myth. There's several. Everyone was telling it orally and over millennia. And we don't know what the original myth was, if there was one. So all we can say is, as far as we can tell from mythology, it happened about like this. Some people say this, some people say that. So there's no original myth. But yeah, it's been pretty cool to be able to look further into the myths and look at the different interpretations people have too. Yes, Teresa.
In your early days as a writer, did you or were you a part of writing groups? I mean, you have a writing group that you'd go to every Friday, or for support, or what's your experience with writing groups?
The main experience I had with that, I think in high school we did it a little, and I know in college I had a year-long tutorial where it was a small group, like about 4 students with the grad student teacher, and we would read each other's work every week and critique it there in class, and say this part, and line by line, tearing it apart, and like you weren't allowed to say anything while the other people talked about your work, and that was kind of intense. But yeah, it's good to go through that, because then you learn, all right, I just have to listen. I have to take this in, and I have to do really well if I'm going to present them anything next time, turn in anything. It takes a lot of nerve. But I haven't done it in person as much. I did also do an online, there's several online ones you can do nowadays. Critique sites, basically, and then you don't know who you're going to get exactly. Whoever wants to read your work and critique it can. And I did get into one of those sites for a few years, and it was pretty helpful too. These days I mostly just get beta readers. Stick to them. I feel like that's where I've gotten to. But yeah, I think maybe in person would probably be better than these online sites where you're not sure what you're going to get. Whichever.
Yeah. I've been writing short stories based on some real-life experiences with animals that I've had. And one of the things that I've delighted in the most, when I look back at these stories, is commentaries that I've written where I've drawn from other fields, and maybe something from physics, something that I read in physics and how it applies to this particular story. I was wondering, do you, even if you don't put it into your writing, do you constantly relate from different areas? Is that part of the fascination of the whole process with the fantasy?
Yeah, I feel like even with this fantasy series where I write, obviously we're dealing with completely impossible things. I ended up doing a fair amount of research, like looking up things like what Bronze Age Greece was like and things so that some details would be right. And it kind of called on my anthropology days for things like that. And I thought about language because I took linguistics, and I thought, well, so how does everyone understand each other in the underworld? If they're all coming from different places in life, what do they speak in the underworld? And I thought, okay, well, there must be a language of the underworld. I'm that annoying person who, when you're watching a movie where someone goes back in time to 2,000 years, I go, there's no way they could understand the language they're speaking right now. How could they possibly? Because I think about language that way. So I think linguistics has certainly influenced me. But it can be all kinds of things. Like when I do look back at things I wrote in the past, I realize I maybe threw in some detail based on something I had recently learned that I had forgotten by now that I had learned. So I think when they say write what you know, that is good, you know, to be able to apply what you know. And the reason it works is because what you know keeps changing. And you might forget some of the things that you now know. So you should use it now. If that's what's on your mind now, you can definitely apply it. And it'll probably change next year and the year after that. Yes, you have.
I just had a conversation this last weekend with my granddaughter about the supernatural. What is supernatural?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering if you think about through all of this time you're spending writing and being in the space, about the difference between what you might call fantasy or impossible and the supernatural.
Mm-hmm.
Given that there is much written on books all over this store about people's supernatural experiences.
Yeah, I know. It's kind of just a genre label that it's in the style of fantasy novels, but it's based on Greek mythology, and I often call it paranormal rather than fantasy as well, because it might relate more to what people would call a paranormal experience, and the way that the characters learn about the existence of the afterlife or the underworld and such is probably more like someone's supernatural experiences. And that kind of thing fascinates me too, and actually some of the other books I've written are like ghost stories. I have ghosts in a couple of my other books because I love ghost stories. That stuff's just really cool. I lived in Edinburgh for a few months, and that's apparently one of the most haunted cities in the world, and I brought back a book of Edinburgh ghost stories and put some of those in a story I wrote about Scotland. So yeah, it is interesting because it kind of also, it's not even just, experiences that people might really have. It's that this all was a lot of people's actual religion for a long time. I think it is still for a few people. It's much rarer now, but that I'm not just writing about pretty stories. Like this was actually practicing religion for people, and I read on that side too. So yeah, there's a certain amount of that in the stories too. The festivals that people were holding to feel closer to the gods and to the afterlife because they just had to know what would happen. And of course, in my version, they can actually meet the gods, but but it was interesting. I did some reading about the ancient Greek rituals as we know of them. There were the Eleusinian Mysteries, is I think I'm saying it right, a cult that was dedicated to Persephone and Demeter and Hades, and apparently they've still kept it. They did such a good job keeping secret what they did in these rites that we're not even entirely sure still to this day what happened in them. But it was supposed to make everyone come out of it feeling much more enlightened and reassured about the afterlife. So it had to do with the Persephone myth and her being taken to the underworld and returning again and all that. So it was a real thing. There's still buildings and ruins out there from people who believed that they were having an experience like that because they went through a rite in a festival. So yeah, it's to us now they're pretty stories and it's kind of fun paranormal stuff, but it was a real thing for the ancient Greeks. It was their belief. So yeah, there's a lot of angles on it.
So do you, just to follow up,
Yeah.
you find yourself, has it changed your thinking about what you as a person, a human, would like to experience in this lifetime? Supernatural.
I've never actually had like a ghost sighting or anything I would really call paranormal, and I don't know if I regret that or if I'm glad because I would be so freaked out. But I wonder, yeah, I'd be open to it. I'd love to have a story like that to say, okay, well, I can't explain this thing that happened to me. So far, I don't have that, but I guess I'd like to see something like that, experience something like that. Maybe not in those creepy, dark underground places in Edinburgh that I saw, but yeah, I do. And I have plenty of friends and people I've known who they swear this thing happened to me. I can't explain it. And I kind of think there might be something there. But yeah, paranormal. The fantasy thing is more like a literary genre label. It's written in the style of fantasy, rather than being impossibility. Yes?
So what was your inspiration, or when did you decide to make the Immortals immortal, in a sense? I was surprised by that, and I thought it was pretty cool. And I couldn't think at first of any examples in Greek mythology where that was the case. And I've since thought of a few examples from other fiction.
Yeah, like, right, Anne Rice's Vampire Chronicles, it's kind of similar to that, like how they, if you work really hard, you can kill these vampires. They're immortal otherwise. That's kind of the same as my Greek gods here. Actually, like when it was called Letters from Hades, they were just immortal. Nothing could kill them. They just could not be. But then I decided I wanted them to be fairly young people this time around, which meant reincarnation, which meant they must have died somehow. So that kind of led me into this whole, well, in that case, how did that happen? Well, although I think there is maybe one example I can think of. Some versions, again, all the versions are the same, of the Dionysus myth having basically being like, I think it's Osiris in Egyptian myth, who gets torn apart and then comes back to life after being put back together. He basically has the same thing happen to him in one of the versions. So he's a dying and rising god that way. There's a whole class of gods they call dying and rising gods because this happens to them. Jesus is one. And Osiris, and there's others that I don't know as well, but Dionysus is considered that just because in one version he gets completely, I forget how, torn apart by followers? That doesn't make sense, but I need to look that up. But yeah, he gets sent to the underworld dead and then reincarnated, or not reincarnated, but resurrected. So that's the only example of from Greek mythology I can think of, other than the people who like get turned into constellations and made immortal that way. Yeah, or get turned into trees. There's a lot of weird things people get turned into, I'm telling you. Rivers. I remember one guy gets turned into a river. I don't know how that works. Yeah, it's interesting stuff. Ovid's Metamorphoses, that's why it's called that. It's people getting turned into stuff. Metamorphoses. There's less of that in my series. They don't bend the laws of physics quite that far.
Any other questions for Molly? Thank you all for coming, and thank you, Molly, for coming today. It's been great.
Thanks, Mike.